Welcome to Defense Art TV. I'm your host, Sifu Robert Brown. Today's show is about body targets and what happens when we strike them. It features Dr. Mike Savona, Hawaii's Doctor of the Year for 2003. So stay tuned for the effects of striking vital zones on Defense Art TV.
Aloha, my name is Sifu Douglas McLeod. We have our special guest, Dr. Savona. Thank you for coming.
You're very welcome, Doug. The major gland we have on each side is the parotid gland, which is here. It's the gland that becomes inflamed in kids when they get the mumps years ago, before they had the mumps vaccine and people would just swell up here. There also are a couple of what we call submandibular glands here, and then inside the mouth there are very small clusters of tissue to make saliva as well. But this is the main one. Okay. Now the other, yes?
I tell my students, because nowadays, you don't know if someone might have some type of disease, they try not to throw knuckles into a person's mouth, obviously, because of blood exchange. Is it possible to get, like if I cut my knuckles and to be able to get something transmitted immediately?
Of course you can, yeah. You know, unfortunately that is true. Now, you know, the issue with that, though, just for everybody to understand, you know, the major diseases that we have concern about are the hepatitis and the HIV virus. Now, what I will tell you is that transmission of these by that route seems to be relatively infrequent. Okay. But it can occur, and it can occur in theory. The issues that have been looked at are that we think that the amount of blood that has to be transmitted has to exceed a volume that would have enough of the virus in it for it to be transmitted. But yes, in theory, it could happen. So if you were to strike somebody and they bled and you bled, kind of like being blood brothers, yeah, it can happen. But at this moment in time, it doesn't happen often. I will tell you also that in medical centers where people have worked with patients with hepatitis, patients with AIDS, and have stuck themselves with needles that they've used on those patients, either to draw blood and whatever, it's taken a significant amount of blood to be transmitted through that route to cause trouble.
How about if I was to bite an opponent or he was to bite me? Would it be, is there any?
It actually turns out, Doug, that certainly for the AIDS virus, that the transmission has to be red blood cells. And that's partly because the virus tends to be carried in the cellular material of the blood, both white blood cells and red blood cells. For hepatitis, it's a secretion issue. And hepatitis can be transmitted by oral secretions, genital and secretions, by blood itself too. So there's part of that. Having said that, you know, bites are the worst wounds to take care of. So I mean, you can, you know, somebody can get really seriously infected with a bite wound. They're the dirtiest of wounds, no matter how good you think your mouth is. Let me tell you, all that stuff with Listerina laboris is hogwash. It really, mouths grow out lots of junk that is really tough to deal with.
So, let's say the opposite. If I do this to my students, I said, well, I used to. If it's a situation, you got to bite them. Would they, if you bit them, would you be safer, obviously, than
you are safer probably, but of course if you bite them and draw blood,
right,
then you're exposing mucous membrane. Remember, a lot of this stuff is transmitted through either blood to blood or mucous membrane, and that has to just do with body's defense against it. One other thing I wanted to bring up about the parotid gland is that the seventh cranial nerve, the facial nerve, passes through that. And that's an easy area to traumatize. And what happens when you traumatize that is somebody's face goes down. They lose all their wrinkles, which may be good, but it paralyzes their face. So, yes, sir.
Question. I would say 10 out of 10 boxers would be, what do we call it in boxing, the head hunters.
Yeah.
Instead of body punching, they will go for the head. And one of the knuckle spot that I've been taught is the temple and right, the low part of the chopper.
Yep.
Any other spot besides that?
Well, you know, again, I think you take your chances. Now, boxers have it a little easier because they wear gloves. you know, and that's...
Don't work, Doc.
I know,
It's worse.
it hurts, yeah, but you see...
No,
yeah.
it's worse.
You mean with the gloves?
I would take a punch from you bare hand.
Oh, no, I know what you're saying. No, I know what you're saying. Yeah, you're right about that, Mike, because the bigger the area that you're striking with, the more the force of the blow. But the purpose of the glove is not to help the guy getting hit as much as it is to protect the hands of the guy who's hitting. Okay, so you need to understand that first. Now, the issue with the temples and the issue with the jaw is purely because of the physics of the whole procedure. If you hit somebody in the front of their head, especially if they're moving, it's kind of like bouncing radar off a stealth plane. It's deflected, okay? But if you're aiming for the temple, because it's a flatter area, you have more chance of making contact and keeping the contact as you swing through.
More energy transfer.
That's right, more energy transfer, and it's the same thing with the jaw. The other thing is that the jaw, because there's a lot of nerve tissue there, is much more sensitive, and once in a while you're lucky you catch somebody with their mouth partially open.
Oh, yeah.
And that makes more trouble for them. Okay. Yeah, and because this moves side to side and whatever, and so it's easier to dislocate it. It's easier to. I mean, even Muhammad Ali had his jaw broken a few times, as good as he was. So I mean, it's one of those things that you just have to be aware of. Now, Muhammad Ali took a lot of blows to the brain, and that probably accounts for why he's got Parkinson's disease now. But a lot of that didn't happen during a fight. So I mean, and how many blows do those guys take to the head?
A strike through this area with a club, say a police officer has to use his glove, so he whacks the guy and he hits him in this area right here. How much damage is he actually doing? Because you're saying now that the bone is protecting.
Well, the bone is, but you're talking about something different here. You're talking about a club, which transmits a lot of force through a very small, narrow contact surface. And of course, the physics of striking with a club brings a lot more force to it than, well, maybe perhaps as much as you could do with a knife hand. But for most everybody else, it's a lot more force than any of us could bring to bear with just a fist. Now, where does the problem come? Well, the calvarium, or surface of the skull, is very thick. That doesn't stop people from getting it cracked. And a lot of times people, when if they have to have surgery for a blow like that, we will see lots of cracks in the bone. But the bone will not be displaced. Where the problem occurs is on the other side of the bone. Okay? And on the other side of the bone, what you can do, because there are these venous sinuses, we call them, they're veins that drain blood flow from the brain, they can rupture and create bleeding on the brain that we call a subdural hematoma.
Okay, the infamous blackjack, okay?
Yeah.
It was explained to me that what causes the trauma is that if you're struck with the blackjack, it hits the skull, but it lays there. The skull goes in, and then the brain hits the skull, and that's what knocks the guy out. Is that right or wrong?
It's probably a little bit of both. What happens with the infamous blackjack is it is the leading cause, or was the leading cause, of depressed skull fractures. A lot of force in a small area. These were lead weights that were in this on a flexible handle, and boom.
I was a former police officer.
Well, there you go. Well, what would happen?
Ran across that.
Sure. What would happen is that the skull would become depressed and strike the brain. And a lot of times, too, they'd be bleeding under it. Now, the other thing that can happen, and this may be what you're referring to, is anytime you hit your skull, you can develop what we call a contre-coup injury. And what that is that the movement, the hit here, causes contents of the brain to shift backwards, and the brain actually contacts the back of the skull, which you didn't hit, and bruises the brain itself.
Change heads that way. The chamber.